Hello everybody and welcome back. Doing things from the desk today, so you know what that means. It is time to talk about all of the books and my stats from 2022. So Kayla does this video every year and I absolutely love it. I think it is fascinating, and the amount of work that she puts into that video with stacking everything and giving you all the visuals is absolutely incredible. I am not that person. I don't own all of the books that I read this year anymore, and my library, not as good as hers, so we're going to be doing this graphic style. We're going to go through every book that I read in 2022. You'll see all of those, what my best were of each month, what my worst were of each month, page count, all of that fun stuff, as well as some just general stats of what my 5 stars were, how many I had, 4 stars, what genre I read the most, etc, etc. So buckle up. I hope you guys enjoy this because it is always fun for me to see all of my stats coming together. So let's just talk about my totals for the year really quickly, because I feel like that's something that I need to go over before we start with each individual month. Okay, so I'm using Goodreads partially for this because my page count for Goodreads and my page count for my spreadsheet don't match up perfectly. So I kind of wanted to give you a side-by-side because I'm not sure if I forgot things, or I know that my book spreadsheet is counting all of like rereads and things like that, whereas Goodreads necessarily isn't. So according to Goodreads, I read 170 books and 63,715 pages. According to my spreadsheet, I read 191 books, including DNFs, whereas without the DNFs, it's 168, so I just probably didn't mark something correctly. And then I read 70,078 pages according to my spreadsheet. And those are going to be a little bit discrepancies because Goodreads page count is not always right. And like I said, my spreadsheet is including DNFs. So I'm pretty happy with my year so far. My goal this year, I think, is going to be 175 books. We'll see. I like being able to see the ticker and I like giving myself something to strive for, but that's 5 more books than I read this year. And I read a lot of books in some of these months, as you guys are about to find out. So let's jump into the month of January. In January, I read 18 books. I DNF'd 2 of those books, and I read 6,850 pages. So I read some pretty good books in the month of January. I read 2 that were on my favorite books of the year list. One was an honorable mention, one was my favorite book of the year. So it's kind of cool that I managed to read my favorite book of the year in the first month of the year, and that was Project Hail Mary by Andy Weir. Also read some really good ones like Elantris. My worst book in the month of January was on my worst books of the year list, and that was Snowflakes. I also read The Overnight Guest, which was on my favorite books of the year. So January overall was just a really solid month. And I'm a little nervous because the rest of the year didn't quite go that well. So I'm hoping for a good January, but I'm also like, did I jinx myself last year? Then we have February, and I read the entire Mind F series in the month of February, although those are just 5 novellas. I only read 15 books. If you include the novellas, it was 4,917 pages. So definitely not as good of a month. And I DNF'd 3 books. These graphics are not showing you the books that I DNF'd or reread. These are just the ones that I completed in their entirety that were new to me. My best book of the month of February was Caliban's War, which was my second favorite book of the year. And my worst book in the month of February, I believe, was either one of the Mind F series or Half a King. And this is also the first month that I joined Backlist Book Club, and we started with Bone Ships, and that was a lot of fun. So it was a really solid month in February. I read some really good books. Moving on to March, I read a total of 16 books. I DNF'd only 1, and I read 7,818 pages. So March was my second best month of the year. I did really well in the month of March. This is the month that I started doing vlogs on my YouTube channel and really started my YouTube channel. I read several of these for my best friends choose what I read vlog. Some really chunkers in here, and I read some great ones like The Black Coast was really good. Empire of Gold, I finished a series and it was one of my favorite books of the year. Some of the duds in the worst book I think on this list is The Paris Apartment. It just really didn't work for me. Black Hawks didn't really work for me. So some wins and some not so wins. It's the month that I finally read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. And it's the month that I really started reading indie. Moving on to April. In the month of April, this was by far my best reading month of the year. This was Realmathon hosted by Covers with Cassidy, and We read some books in April. You'll see as we start to trickle down through the rest of the year, I burnt myself out just a little bit, but that's okay because I had so much fun. So in April, I read a total of 29 books with 8,180 pages. So I didn't read that many more pages than I did in the month of March, but I did read a lot of shorter books, and I DNF'd only 2. So I think my best book from April was probably There Are No Saints by Sophie Lark. This was on my best books of the year, and the worst was probably There Is No Devil by Sophie Lark, which was on my worst books of the year. I read some duds in the month of April. I didn't love several of these. Recursion. I just saw Recursion. Recursion was my best book of the month of April. That was the 3rd book on my best books of the year this year, but There Are No Saints was also excellent. I continued the Expanse series with Abaddon's Gate. The Fall is on here, which was on my best books of the year, so I managed to get 3 best books of the year out of April, and I'm going to consider that a solid win. Moving on to May. May is where we started to take a little bit of a hit, but not too bad. I did read 23 books in the month of May, but I DNF'd 5 of those 23. May was a hard month, especially toward the end of the month for me, where I just got to where I did not want to read anymore. We had some big life stuff happen at the end of May that was really hard, and my reading took a little bit of a hit, but the beginning of the month made up for it. I think my best book in the month of May was probably one of the dark romances. So this was also the month of 72 Hours in the Smut Den that was hosted by the Late Night Crew. It was a ton of fun. But we also read the Book of Cold Cases for the Unofficially Official Book Club. That was not a favorite. So it was kind of a mixed bag in the month of May. I managed to read 7,352 pages though, so that's pretty awesome. And then we go into June where we go on the reading. I only read 10 books in the month of June. I DNF'd 1, and I only read 4,177 pages. So June was definitely a worse month for me. I read my dad's favorite books for the month of June. Wish that had gone a little bit better. So Gardens of the Moon was probably my worst book of June. Part of me still really wants to try that again, thinking maybe I wasn't in the right headspace for it. But the other part of me says, why would you do that? So we'll see. My best book of June is probably either The Expanse or Bloody Heart, but the worst book was definitely City of Dusk by Tara Sim. Okay, moving on to the month of July. July we picked back up a little bit, and I read 17 books, DNF'd 3 of those books, unfortunately, and read a total of 5,635 pages. This also had some best and worst books of the year in here. Ashes of the Sun by Django Wexler started my love for Django Wexler. Absolutely loved that book. There were some disappointing anticipated releases in this month, like Upgrade by Blake Crouch. And then the worst book of the year was in July, and that was The Lion Game by Ruth Ware. It was just not the book for me. Not the book for me at all. Moving on to August. Read some decent books in August, read some duds in August. I only read 11 books, DNF'd 1 of them for a total of 4,964 pages. Really enjoyed The Bitter Twins. This was the second book in the Wind Wing Flame trilogy, was reading that for the Backlist Book Club. Again, with The Expanse. Unfortunately, Things We Do in the Dark and Stay Awake were both duds, and they were both anticipated duds, so that kind of stinks. Then in September, I read 13 books, only DNF'd 1, and read a total of 4,857 pages. Pretty good books in September. The Kiss Curse was awesome. I really enjoyed that one. We got another Amari. I enjoyed that one, but I also read some things that I did not love. This started my vlog series for the spooky season of October, and I did myself a little dirty by trying to find books to fit a theme rather than finding a theme to fit books. And I'm going to try to do better about that this year for sure, because it made for a lot of books that I just did not really enjoy. There were several on here that I wanted to read anyway, but they just did not quite live up to the hype. So moving on to October, I read 15 books, I DNF'd only 1, and I read 5,726 pages. So we started to come up a little bit in the month of October. Again, this was those vlogs that I just shouldn't have picked those books for. I think my best book of the month was probably either Her Soul to Take or Silver Under Nightfall. I really enjoyed both of those, but The Caro Haunt was read in the month of October, and Carol Hunt really kicked off my love for Darcy Coates. Even though I only gave this a 3-star, that was mostly due to the last like 10% of the book. For the majority of it, I was having a great time and read several Darcy Coates after that I really enjoyed. So definitely loving the Darcy Coates train. Then in November, I read 15 books, DNF'd 1 and read 6,097 pages. I finished out a series with The Enclaves, read some more Darcy Coates, finished out a series with Emperor of Rune, and you remember me talking about Ashes of the Sun. That was a solid 4-star series. Really loved it. Got to some books that people have been bugging me to read for forever, like Furies of Calderon, and I also started my SPFBO reading vlog series with Small Miracles. And then moving on to my last books of the year, in December, I only read 9 books for 3,505 pages and DNF'd 2. December was a really busy month, and I just did not have the time or the mental capacity to read, and that's okay. I read some good ones. I read A Touch of Light in December, which I really loved and cannot wait to get to the sequel. Unfortunately, I had some duds with Leech and A Song for the Void, but that's okay because we ended the year strong. So those are all of the books that I read this year, gone down by month. Let's look at how many 5 stars and then kind of break that down a little bit. So looking at star rating, I did not have a lot of 5 stars this year. I only read 8 5 stars this year, and I think several of these were rereads, so that's why they're not going to show up in the 5-star graphic. I just didn't have a lot of great 5-star reads, and that's a sad day. We're going to hope to fix that in 2023, and we're going to move on to the 4 stars. I had substantially more 4 stars, and for me, a 4-star is still a really solid read, and I had 45 4 stars. I'm so happy with all of these books that I read this year, and just looking at them all together is extremely satisfying. Moving on to the 3 stars, obviously I had the most 3 stars. For me, you can have a high 3-star that is a solid I loved it book, and then you can have a lower 3-star that's I don't regret reading it, but it was kind of meh, and we're shoving all of those together in this graphic. I read 73 3-star books this year, which is fine. I mean, I expect for that to make up the majority of my reading. For me, if I rated everything a 4 and a 5-star, yeah, I'm glad I'm loving the books, but then there's no like scale, I guess, to know which ones were the best. And so I'm okay with having a decent amount of 3-star reads. Then we have the 1 and the 2 stars. And unfortunately, I had more 1 and 2 stars than I ever would have wanted to. I had 31 2 stars and 4 1-star books. This is the year that I decided that I was going full scale and I was going to give a 1-star if I needed to, and there were a couple that I needed to, but for the most part I DNF'd books that I wasn't enjoying. This graphic's bigger than I would want for it to be, but it still turned out alright. Moving on to a couple of other just like miscellaneous stats. I read mostly audiobooks with some ebooks this year. Looking at genre I think is kind of cool because all of my top 3 books of the year were sci-fi. And I've always considered myself a fantasy girly, and I still think that fantasy is going to, live rent free. But I really want to lean into more horror and sci-fi this year. It's a genre that I found that I really enjoyed this last year. And I was kind of looking at my stats and it reflects that somewhat, but not as much as I would have expected. So fantasy obviously makes up the bulk of the graph with 66 books and 35% of what I read this year. That's lower than I usually find it to be, but I also tracked more genres this year, so that may have caused a little bit of it because I had a separate genre for paranormal that was 6 books and 3%. Had a separate category for fantasy romance, which was 21 books and 11%, which is more than I thought. That's a lot more than I thought it would be. I read actually a pretty decent amount of romance this year at 9.5% and 18 books, which was the same as sci-fi, shockingly, at 18 books and 9.5%. Really surprised by that, and I want to crank up that sci-fi stat next year. If you shove mystery and thriller together, which a lot of people do, I read 30 mystery thrillers for 15% of the books that I read last year. And then I actually read 32 horror for a total of 17% of the books that I read last year. So pretty good amount of horror. A lot of that was in late September, October, early November, but I'm happy with it. Then let's just pop on over to, I guess, book length. I'm going to be tracking book length a little bit differently next year. We're only going to be doing small books, so under 300 pages. Then we're going to be doing medium, which is 300 to 500 pages. Chunky, which is 500 to 800 pages, and then She's a Chonk, over 800 pages. So I don't really love how many different options there were for this graph, but kind of just looking at it, most of my books were the 300 to 400 page length, and then a pretty substantial amount from 400 to 450. I think a lot of that is coming from the large amount of romance and mystery thrillers that I read. They tend to be on the lower side of the graph, and horror. Horror tends to be shorter too. I actually read a pretty decent amount of 450 to 500 page books, about 20 of those. I didn't read a lot of under 100. That was probably like maybe 5 or 6 looking at this graph, and then not a whole lot over 700 pages. It looks like, so maybe like 6 books over 700 pages, maybe like 3 or 4 over 600 pages. So the majority of my reading was under 500 this year, which again really surprises me with all of the fantasy books, and kind of want to crank that up next year. I feel like I'm missing out on my big books. Let's see. Oh, and I also read across 8 different genres this year. Okay, moving on to age category. I don't feel like we need to go into this too much. I read 90% of my books were adult books with a couple of young adult and a couple of middle grade sprinkled in there, but for the most part, I read mostly adult, and I don't even think I'm going to track that next year. Looking at publication year, this one I don't track well. I didn't do a very good job marking all of those. Eventually I got to where it was either a new release, released within the last year, or a backlist, and that was it. I stopped tracking arcs. Most of my books are backlist at 70%, and then about 30% of those were new releases. If you go back and look really hard at my monthly stats, then you'll see that the new releases kind of did me dirty this year, and so I'm, at least with the mystery thrillers, I think I'm going to hold off on buying those until I've either read them or have gotten them seriously vetted. I only did a few rereads this year. I reread 6 books. I don't reread a whole lot, so that doesn't surprise me. I read about 36% of my books were standalones, and 63% of those were part of series. We'll be seeing my series videos coming out this week. I started way more series than I should have, so that doesn't surprise me. And then I thought this graph was really cool. That was number of books by author. It's just a hot mess express. Like, you can't really pull a super ton out of that, other than you can tell that I read a lot of Django Wexler. I read a lot of Darcy Coates. Like, by far Darcy Coates was the most read author last year, and that was all in the last like 3 months of the year, so that's really cool. Sophie Lark, I actually read a lot of Sophie Lark, a romance author. Surprise. St. Abbey, that one I don't really count because they were all novellas that made up essentially the same book. James S.A. Corey, I read 5 of the Expanse series this year. I'm going to be finishing, or last year, I'm going to be finishing that off this year. I read not as many Robin Hobb as I would have wanted because I should have continued with the series and I didn't. I read 4 Ruth Ware, so pretty solid. I'm very happy. I read across 139 different authors this year, which is really cool, and I want to continue to find new and incredible authors in the future. Okay guys, so I think that those are all of the stats that I managed to track this year. Just looking at Goodreads, it tells me that my shortest book was Snowflakes by Ruth Ware. My longest book was House of Sky and Breath by Sarah J. Maas at 800 pages. My average length was 373 pages. My average rating was sad. It was a 3.2 according to Goodreads, which is not terrible. Like, I'm okay with that. It could have been worse. So I think that this was a solid reading year. Looking back, reflecting on it, it was a lot of fun, and I cannot wait to see what my first full year on BookTube looks like. It's incredible. It's so much fun, and I don't regret for a second making this channel. I hope you guys will all take the journey with me, and you'll be here next year to watch how this video evolves and grows. Thank you guys so very much for watching. Let me know down in the comments what stats you find the most interesting and what you track. If you just wanted to let me know you were here and you watched it, leave me a pencil emoji. As always, links to my Instagram, Twitter, Goodreads, Patreon are all down in the description box below. Please give this video a big thumbs up if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.